Hello, everyone. Good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are. So we'll just wait until everybody sort of trickles in for the next minute or few seconds, and we will start our super special session today. All right. Still some more. All right, so welcome again, everyone. I would like to ask you to, if possible, to please set your screen on speaker view. That way you would get a more enriching experience during this session. And please leave your microphones muted. You will be able, of course, to put in your comments and questions in the chat box, and we will be having a Q&A session towards the end of the event. Okay, so as many of you know, we have a very special guest this evening. We are very honored to welcome Professor Fiona Sampson, who is a leading British poet and writer, who has published in 38 languages, who has received international awards in the US, India, Macedonia, Albania, and Bosnia. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, of the English Association, and of the Wordsworth Trust. She's published 27 books and received an MBE for services to literature. She has served on the Council of the Royal Society of Literature and is a trustee of the Royal Literary Fund. Other honors include the Newdigate Prize, the Hawthornden Den Fellowship, and awards from the Arts Councils of England and of Wales, Society of Authors, Poetry Book Society, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, as well as various Book of the Year selections. She's also a broadcaster and newspaper critic, librettist and literary translator, and was editor of Poetry Review from 2005 to 2012. Her internationally acclaimed book, In Search of Mary Shelley, was shortlisted for the Biographers Club Slightly Fox Prize. She recently received two major European prizes, the 2019 Naim Frasheri Laureateship of Albania and Macedonia, and the 2020 European Lyric Atlas Prize, Bosnia. Two-Way Mirror, her biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was published last month in February 2021 and will be forthcoming in the US in August 2021. She is Emeritus Professor of Poetry at Roehampton University. Professor Fiona Sampson, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rula. Thank you for inviting me to this festival, which is amazing. As I was saying to you earlier, I think everything about it is incredibly impressive. The whole enterprise, the way you're making international connections at a time when we're all so cut off from each other. And it's also just an incredibly professional and slick operation. And that's to die for. When I'm thinking about print, I love high production quality, and I love it in digital stuff too. So thank you so much for this and for your generous introduction. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk, that's to say I'm going to give a talk, and Rula is going to drive the PowerPoint, which is very kind of her. And you know my title, which I think, Rula, we might go to now, please. So I'm going to talk about Elizabeth Barrett Browning as a pioneering poet. I'm umming because I've just suddenly... There we are. My screen suddenly went funny. As Rula was saying, I spent a long time thinking about and working on Mary Shelley, and I fell in love with Mary Shelley, and I found Mary Shelley's life story really compelling because it seems to me to be a story about what goes into the unconscious of a maker. Whereas, in other words, to put it another way, how did she write Frankenstein? How did she create a myth and two enduring archetypes when she was only a teenager? I think that Elizabeth Barrett Browning is, on the contrary, a story about the conscious self and how someone chooses to become. So how they choose their vocation, how they develop the skills, and how they succeed or don't succeed. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning succeeded wonderfully, as I think I'm going to argue right now, in their direction of travel. So there's the unconscious life that makes you a writer, and there's the conscious life that makes you a writer. And what's really interesting is that Elizabeth Barrett Browning's own masterpiece was her best-selling verse novel, Aurora Lee, which is about how a woman becomes a poet. It starts with the tempting suggestion that the self on the page mirrors the self who writes the page. And it opens like this. Of writing many books, there is no end. And I, who have written much in prose and verse for others' uses, will write now for mine. Will write my story for my better self, as when you paint your portrait for a friend who keeps it in a drawer and looks at it long after he has ceased to love you, just to hold together what he was and is. And I think this idea of holding together of the self is the thread that I've spent the last 3 years following to lead me to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She's a canonical figure in English literature, but to my astonishment, she hadn't had another full-length biography since 1988. Could we change the slide, please? This and the next one, please. This is my favorite portrait of EBB, as she liked to style herself. In it, you can see she simultaneously turns away and looks back over her shoulder at us. In one sense, of course, every historical figure does this, glancing over their shoulder towards the future where we're watching them, even while they face away from us into their own time. But Barrett Browning makes the gesture particularly provocative. Her wide, sensual mouth dips and rises in a curly bracket. Skeptical, even teasing, her gaze has a directness that seems startlingly modern, which is an irony, since it's an image that has been constructed by thoroughly old-fashioned means. The frontispiece for the 4th British edition of her best-selling verse novel is an engraving after an ambrotype, taken specifically for this purpose. So an ambrotype is an early type of daguerreotype type of photograph. On the afternoon in September of 1858, when a shutter falls on the poet's half-smile in a stuffy studio on Le Havre harbourfront, photography is understood to be neither artistic nor detailed enough for portraiture. It will be another half dozen years before Julia Margaret Cameron starts to produce her famous, markedly pre-Raphaelite images of friends and family. And so the portrait that eventually results from this sitting won't be created by the photographer, but by a founder member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who is a friend of EBB, as his celebrated subject styles herself, and of her husband and fellow poet, Robert Browning. Let's go to the next slide. But Rossetti's are not the only hands her image passes through. First, it's engraved by a less stellar craftsman, Thomas Oldham Barlow. And Barlow wasn't working from this photograph, but from another one in the same sitting. But you can see there's a million miles between the final Rossetti portrait and this rather haggard image of Elizabeth Barrett Browning at the age of 52. I mean, you can see not only that she's immensely camera shy, she's detesting being photographed. She has no camera manner, but she also looks terrible. She's got this girlish hairstyle and then this drawn, ill face. Nevertheless, Rossetti instructs his engraver to be faithful to the photographic portrait. For example, removing, I quote, a sort of smile not in the photograph and not characteristic of the original. Rossetti's had plenty of chances to study this original at the Brownings' home, which he calls, quotes, an evening resort where I never feel unhappy. In the 2 years since the hugely successful appearance of Aurora Lee, Elizabeth's pioneering 9-book Bildungsroman, telling the story of how a woman came, his initial impressions of, quotes, as unattractive a person as can well be imagined, she looks quite worn out with illness and speaks in the tone of an invalid, have turned to admiring protectiveness. So now he replaces the photographer's stock studio furniture with a symbolic writing desk, and he instructs Barlow to darken their subject's hair and enlarge her signature dark eyes to make her look younger and a little less worn out with illness. After all, this portrait's whole purpose is to extinguish what her husband calls, quotes, certain horrible libels on humanity published as portraits of her in America. Earlier, shipping a copy of the photograph itself to Aurora Lee's American publishers, Robert Browning has assured them just a shade too urgently that what you receive is the sun's simple truth without a hair's breadth of retouching. Well, up from Italy to spend the summer with Elizabeth's English family, the Brownings have picked out Le Havre as a halfway meeting point. On the very last day of what turned out to be 2 unsatisfactory, tiring months at the Normandy port, Robert has found a clever man, as he calls him, to conduct a photographic session with his camera-shy wife. Jean-Victor Macaire-Warneau and his brother Louis Cyrus Macaire, who share the waterfront studio, are renowned technical pioneers. Yet the image that briefly saw commercial distribution in North America is oddly unclear, and the publishers, C.F. Francis & Co., do not use it. And if you want to see this image, you can Google Browning correspondence and go onto the website, which has been archived by Philip Kelly and with the support of Baylor University's Armstrong Browning Library, and you can see the photograph I'm talking about there, but obviously for copyright reasons, I'm not using it right now. So let's just switch back to the previous slide, if we may. So if we look closer at the photograph on the archive, for all Robert's insistence that there isn't a hair's breadth of retouching, it turns out to have been clumsily overpainted. And in fact, within 2 sentences in his letter, he contradicts himself, remarking that Macaire-Warneau has worked up detail that got lost in the reproductive process. But who, apart from Robert, who is a keen amateur artist, could have such a strong motive for intervention when it overrules plain sight? We can't be absolutely sure that we've caught him red-handed, but what we do know is that luckily he's kept back an untouched original, and this is the version that Barlow and Rossetti use. In it, as you can see, the unexpurgated Elizabeth Barrett Browning has dark eyes and arched dark eyebrows. Her nose is long, so is her upper lip with its sexy overbite. Her face is asymmetric. Cover the right side and the left seems soulful and focused. Cover the left and the right appears amused. In the 21st century, we've recognized instantly the Brownings' anxiety about this key publicity shot and their need to control the image of the international celebrity that 52-year-old Elizabeth has become by 1858. The great irony is that, despite being so anxiously aware of the ramifications of image making, she's destined to become a notorious object lesson in how the images of famous individuals get distorted. The Brownings would have been astonished and mortified to see myths about their private life obscure first her work and eventually even her identity. Let's go on to the next slide. Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a pivotal literary and cultural figure, changing the direction of English language poetry and influencing both her contemporaries and subsequent generations of poets and readers. She also exerted real social political clout, and her ethical poetics changed debates about child labor, rape, and the trafficking of women, Italian independence, and the American abolition of slavery. Still acknowledged as Britain's greatest ever woman poet, she is the author of one of the most famous and much quoted poems in the language, How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. When she died, she was mourned as a political heroine in revolutionary Italy. Yet, within 70 years of her death, popular culture would reduce her to a swooning poetess, into whose little, couch-bound life only a tyrannical father and an ardent poet-lover brought drama. And you can see here this cast actually from the clasped hands of Elizabeth and Robert, which is a sort of consolidation, literally, of the myth of the of the romantic as the lover of Robert Browning rather than the individual woman writer, even though it's also a very touching bronze and I'm very fond of it. The damage to her reputation was done above all by Rudolph Bézier's 1931 Broadway hit, The Barretts of Wimpole Street, which was followed by 3 film versions, a Norma Shearer and Charles Lawton vehicle, 1957's remake with Jennifer Jones and John Gielgud, and the 1982 TV movie with Jane Lapotaire and Joss Ackland. By the 1970s, when Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, and John Updike were crowding the book charts, the roaring boys of North American literary criticism will go a stage further, maligning Elizabeth Barrett Browning as relevant to the history of literature only through her marriage, or worse, as hindering that real writer, her husband. In 1973's Oxford Anthology of English Literature, handsome paired volumes designed as an authoritative student resource, which have trained many of the people who are still teaching in faculties today, Lionel Trilling and Harold Bloom pronounce, quotes, Miss Barrett became an invalid for still mysterious reasons from 1838 to 1846, when she eloped with the best poet of the age. Her long poem, Aurora Lee, 1856, was much admired even by Ruskin, but is very bad. Quite bad, too, are the famous sonnets from the Portuguese. Though the Brownings' married life was reasonably happy, Mrs. Browning's enthusiasms gave her husband much grief, which is straying, it seems to me, very far from literary criticism. It's quite remarkably ad hominem or ad feminam, and gives no grounds for its claim that her writing is either very bad or quite bad. But perhaps the tendentiousness of this is unsurprising. The anthology's editors print just one minor poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but then the only other writing by women to feature in its more than 4,500 pages comprises a minor poem each by Edith Sitwell and Stevie Smith, 2 by Emily Bronte, and some passages from Dorothy Wordsworth's diaries. In total, fewer than 24 pages, or around 0.5% of their canon, which is a figure that always amuses me, since, of course, 0.5% alcohol counts as alcohol-free. Let's go on to the next slide, which is a little look at Wimpole Street, the famous Wimpole Street that Bézier made so famous. This is not actually the Barrett's house in Wimpole Street, because that was destroyed by a Second World War bomb, but it's one remaining in the terrace. Let's go on to the next slide as well. The Oxford Anthology also excludes all of the Bronte's novels, Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and many more. And literary revisionism on this scale is strenuous stuff. Within this continual reputation making and remaking, that is literary history, Elizabeth Barrett Browning has remained a bellwether for the rising and sinking stock of women writers. It's probably no coincidence that the melodramatic exploitation of her life story came to an end in the 1980s as women's writing became more widely read, rediscovered, and taught. Half a century earlier, when The Barretts of Wimpole Street was already a pop cultural phenomenon, Virginia Woolf, who herself went to see the play, summed up Barrett Browning's then standing, quotes, passionate lovers in curls and side whiskers, oppressed, defiant, eloping. In this guise, thousands of people must know and love the Brownings who have never read a line of their poetry. But fate has not been kind to Mrs. Browning as a writer. Nobody reads her, nobody discusses her, nobody troubles to put her in her place. Yet Woolf herself was complicit in this. Her own version of Elizabeth Barrett Browning is Flush, a biography, which is written from the reductive perspective of Elizabeth's pet spaniel. Here it is in the actual Hogarth Press edition. So talk about complicity in that canon making or unmaking. Elizabeth's life, however, dramatizes the two-way creation of every writing self, from without and from within. That the life of the body both enables and limits the life of the mind is a paradox of the thinking self. John Keats's early death, or the 17-year-old poet's suicide in Henry Wallace's The Death of Chatterton, are moving because they remind us how a dead poet falls silent. But life imposes its own limits on the writer. For every Lord Byron or Malcolm Lowry seizing the day in ways that their work celebrates, there's a John Clare or a Primo Levi trying to write experience away. Let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. We can see writers' bodies creating a kind of resistance, forcing interplay between self and world. Elizabeth Barrett Browning turned 12 in 1818, the year that Frankenstein's creature first found out how deeply what happens to a body changes its wearer. And perhaps it's no accident that he's the creation of another woman writer. It used to be a feminist truism that René Descartes had it wrong, and there is no separation between mind and body. Yet, bodies do disguise, shield, or isolate minds. The woman the scaffolders whistle at may well be mulling pioneering research. To spend any time with someone whose body is failing is to understand that recognizing the unimpaired selfhood within is both human and humane. So, do we inhabit the body in ways that are inseparable from how we think and feel? Or are we ghosts in a curvaceous machine, to borrow from the formulation of 20th century British language philosopher Gilbert Ryle? Today, the virtual world seems to offer us the experience of ourselves as pure will, without the resistances of the concrete world. And if we turn back 2 centuries, we find Elizabeth Barrett Browning using the written word in virtual ways to take part in the wider world while remaining bodily at home on her daybed. In doing so, she was transcending chronic illness, disability, gender, lack of education, as well as her belief that she was of mixed heritage. In the event, the thinking self that speaks in Elizabeth Barrett Browning's work has triumphantly outlived her bodily self. But how telling it is that the fictionalized character of Elizabeth that's replaced her in the popular imagination is almost entirely bodily, scarcely a mind at all. In which context, it's a real pleasure to see this early edition of Aurora Lee, in which Elizabeth, as it were, faces her fictional alter ego, Aurora Lee, across the double spread of the page. Let's go on to the next slide. This is Hope End, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's childhood home. She was born in County Durham in 1806, the first of what would eventually be 12 children. In 1809, her father bought Hope End in Herefordshire, not so far from where I'm sitting today, where he spent a fortune building a new mansion in Orientalist style. There followed an idyllic childhood. The Barrett siblings were close, and Elizabeth's talent was recognised early by her parents, who preserved and even published her juvenilia. However, with adolescence came the onset of the ill health that was to define much of the rest of her life. And when she was 15, she spent a year away from home at Gloucester Spa Hotel, confined to a spinal sling. This was the start of a pattern of poor diagnosis and treatment, which led to an adult life of chronically disabling, often life-threatening lung disease. It also introduced the laudanum, to which she would be addicted for the rest of her life. And actually, if we go on to the next slide, we can see Gloucester Spa, which is nothing like the splendid spa pump rooms of Cheltenham nearby, or of Bath, more famously. Although Elizabeth's mother, Mary Barrett Moulton Barrett, died in 1828 when Elizabeth was 22, her status as an invalid and confined to her room released this eldest daughter from the normal domestic responsibilities. She was able to devote herself to her largely self-taught intellectual development, especially a fierce pursuit of excellence in translating Greek verse and in her own poetry. From the outside, these years look somewhat featureless. At the same time, however, a contested will relating to her father's inheritance was forcing retrenchment. And Elizabeth's mid-20s coincided with a period of intense familial anxiety. The possibility of having to live on the family's estates in Jamaica was mooted. So was the related likelihood that the family themselves were partly of African Caribbean heritage, something which in that era would have transformed their life chances. Elizabeth herself internalized racism and would later confide, though only once, and to Robert, that she believed she had what she called the cursed blood of a slave. And that, I have to say, was a quite reasonable assumption, given that she had first cousins and other very close relations who did have mixed heritage. Deeply embroiled in this emerging writer's psyche, too, was the paradox that at the same time, money from plantations, and so by extension from slavery and slaving, had kept the family in style. Yet Elizabeth would become an ardent abolitionist and advocate of human rights. In 1832, as a result of all this, when she was 26, Hope End was sold, and the family moved first to Sidmouth and then to London. The next years were a period of consolidation for Elizabeth, who began to develop literary friendships brokered by family friends with writers, editors, and artists. She'd stepped into the professional literary world, a productive life, if one that had to be lived carefully indoors seemed possible. But let's go to the next slide, please. The years from 32 to 35 were a period of frustration and loss. Two of Elizabeth's brothers died, including her favourite, the eldest, Bro, or Edward. And she spent 3 lonely years in exile in Torquay, here in Beacon Terrace, fighting chronic pulmonary illness. The benefits of sea air were slow to materialise, and by 1840, she was not only grieving, but believed she was dying. Still, in 1838, her father had acquired 50 Wimpole Street, and it was here that she rejoined her family the following year, though she'd actually lived at the address famously associated with her for a total of fewer than 6 years. The poet had her own bed-sitting room, from which she rarely stirred. Her resulting output was so substantial that when William Wordsworth died in 1850, she became the first woman to be nominated for the post of Poet Laureate. Of course, it would take another 159 years before a woman was actually appointed. In the event, the honour went to Alfred Tennyson. Still, in this era, Elizabeth was becoming more and more respected critically and more influential, with a developing mass readership among the emerging Victorian middle class. Her poem, The Cry of the Children, published in the mainstream Blackwoods magazine in 1843, was instrumental in the campaign to abolish child labour. Poems 1844 made her one of Britain's most widely read writers, at a time when poetry had a mass readership. At a time when many women writers, including Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, the Bronte sisters, and George Eliot, had felt compelled to write under male pseudonyms or anonymously, moreover, Elizabeth was publishing under her own name. Let's have the next slide and see the actual Wimpole Street. You can see it's a later building. One of Elizabeth's newfound admirers after Poems 1844 was a fellow poet, Robert Browning. 6 years her junior and only modestly successful, he nevertheless had a number of distinguished literary friends, including Thomas Carlyle and Walter Savage Landor, and he had an accurate appreciation of the importance of Elizabeth's work. He began a correspondence and eventually a year-long courtship that culminated in September 1846 in a secret marriage. A week later, the couple ran away together to Europe. Elizabeth was 40 by now and an established literary figure, but she was also her father's favourite, the frail and gifted eldest child. He was by now a widower of uncertain social standing without extended family in Britain. And what's more, he was empowered by the paternalism of congregational Christianity. He seems to have been unable to let any of his children marry, and he disowned all 3 of those who did. But I think that Edward Moulton Barrett Sr. was a complex and interesting figure because he was at the same time Elizabeth's first mentor. Still, Elizabeth had to run away from him in order to have a life of her own. She declared in letters home that Robert was perfect in all respects. But true love is nothing without the material means for it to happen, and she was exceptionally lucky in being financially independent of her father, thanks to personal legacies. Let's go on to the next slide. By the October of 1846, the Brownings had arrived in Italy, where they would settle for the rest of Elizabeth's life. And this was funded largely, but not entirely, by Elizabeth's personal money. After an idyll in a hotel in Pisa, they moved to Florence the following spring, and after a few months found themselves a home on the Piano Nobile of Palazzo Guidi, which Elizabeth came to call Casa Guidi. And here you can see it, that first floor, narrow balcony, the long French windows opposite the church. 1848 was a time of optimism in the city, the moment of La Giovane Italia and of hopes for an independent Republic of Italy. In this happy mood and busy homemaking, Elizabeth fell pregnant for what was already a third time, and at the age of 43, gave birth to her son, who came to be called Pen. He was christened Pennini for Robert's mother. Over the next years, both poets also undertook striking creative developments. And during the 1850s, they made repeated journeys back to Britain to see their families and, primarily for Elizabeth's health, to various Italian summer resorts and in the winters, south to Rome. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the interior of the drawing room of Casa Guidi, which has been wonderfully refurbished. Elizabeth proved herself in this new life to be, so to speak, intellectually warm-blooded. She'd always enjoyed literary gossip, and in Italy, improved health allowed her to socialize with many of the key writers and artists of her day, among them Hans Christian Andersen, Thomas Carlyle, George Sand, John Ruskin. She embraced the Italian political situation, most influentially in the book-length poem, which was eventually published as Casa Guidi Windows in 1851. In 1848, she published The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point in the anti-slavery US magazine Liberty Bell. It's still today a blood-curdling poem, very strong about the obscenity of enslavement and about how enslavement is much more than simply an economic relation, a cynical, brutal economic relation. It's cruel and sadistic in a very Baroque way. Her runaway slave has been raped and has given birth to a child as a result, and kills this child and is herself killed. And Elizabeth, by giving it to an abolitionist magazine, was helping fundraise for the abolitionist cause. Her sequence of 44 sonnets from the Portuguese, first published in 1850 under that title to disguise their personal nature, had in fact been written secretly about Robert Browning back in 1846 during the lovers' courtship. Then in 1856, she published the hugely influential Aurora Lee, which was also an immediate bestseller. All of this was in many ways a model life. But even so much happiness must have its unhappy ending, it seems. By 1859, Elizabeth was once again increasingly unwell, flirting morbidly with spiritualism until her hope even in that ran out. She died in June 1861 at the age of 55 at home in Florence. Today, the apartment in Casa Guidi is open as a museum. Its furnishings painstakingly recollected or reconstructed so it appears just as the Brownings left it. So many of the things in that room, in the whole apartment, are actually the very objects that Elizabeth and Robert owned and touched. Elizabeth's chaise longue from Wimpole Street is there. And at the back of the room, you can see the mirror, the very ornate mirror, which actually appears in Robert Browning's The Ring and the Book, and in which Elizabeth will have paused to check her reflection. So it's very uncanny looking into that mirror when you go around the apartment today. You can see also that the couple shared the aesthetic tastes of their day. Their friend John Ruskin had published the 2 volumes of Modern Painters in 1843 and 46, and his highly influential The 7 Lamps of Architecture appeared in 1849 after he'd undertaken a series of tours of Italy. So the Brownings were living an original that would soon be copied across Britain by Pugin and his imitators, in schools and churches and other public buildings. Small wonder, perhaps, that when Elizabeth died in that room in Casa Guidi, in her husband's arms on June the 29th, 1861, her last word recorded by him was beautiful. Let's go on to the next slide. But hers isn't a story about art or life as just beauty, but as willpower. When Elizabeth emerges as a child prodigy and declares not only that she will be a poet, but that she already is one, it should be a reach too far. In 1806, the year of her birth, women can neither vote nor, in England at least, own property once married. Even the wealthiest receive relatively little formal education and are barred from all but the oldest profession. Somebody listening needs to put their mute on, please. On marriage, women passed from their father's control to their husbands without becoming citizens in their own right. So it's not surprising that at the start of the 19th century, women writers tended to emerge in the company of literary men who brought them along too, whether by accident or design. The exceptional talents of Maria Edgeworth, 1768 to 1849, Mary Shelley, who was born in 1797, died in 1851, and the Bronte sisters, born between 1816 and 1820, were all first recognized by educated intellectual fathers. And Elizabeth's father, though no litterateur, also encouraged his young daughter. Perhaps she owes her remarkable confidence to him. She says, "Literature was the star which in prospect illuminated my future days. It was the spur which prompted me, the aim, the very soul of my being." And she was asserting this at the age of 14. Born 9 years after Mary Shelley and 10 before Charlotte Bronte, she starts writing as a child of 6 and doesn't stop until 5 weeks before she dies. Her first surviving poem, called On the Cruelty of Forcement to Man, which is about press gangs, is written in the Herefordshire country house of her childhood. Her last, The North and the South, almost 4 decades later in Rome in May 1861, and dedicated to Hans Christian Andersen. So this obviously is Elizabeth's rather magnificent tomb in Florence. But let's go on to the next slide. This is Elizabeth with her son Pen, about 18 months before she died. So what of the link between the poet and her poetry? We started with Aurora Lee, the masterpiece Elizabeth publishes at 50, in which the fictional poet Elizabeth has invented writes a poetic masterpiece which we never get to read. But we do get to read how she feels about it, about her commitment to poetry. As Aurora Lee says to her doubting cousin, "I may love my art. You'll grant that even a woman may love art, seeing that to waste true love on anything is womanly, past question." Which is rhetoric which sounds like an own goal, but is in fact strategic. Lacking both social agency and an education in the classical arts of logic and rhetoric that father or husband have received, a woman born at the start of the 19th century is unlikely to win arguments by reasoning about who or what she is. She must learn instead to be stubborn, to be irrational. To claim that she too is a poet, she must arm herself with her own weakness, which is to say her enthusiasm. Quotes, "I lived those days and wrote because I lived, unlicensed else. My heart beat in my brain." Let's go on to the next photo, which is Elizabeth's solo. Elizabeth's own success will be indubitable, the kind poets dream of and rarely achieve. Aurora Lee, with which she crowns that success, will be an instant bestseller, its first edition selling out within a fortnight, and go on to be one of the best read literary works of the second half of the 19th century. When it appeared, form-expanding romantic biographies and memoirs by men, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions of 1782, or William Godwin's Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication of the Rights of Woman of 1798, have long been current, while Charlotte Bronte lists, quotes, Lives of the Poets, Boswell's Life of Johnson, Southey's Life of Nelson, Lockhart's Life of Burns, Moore's Life of Sheridan, Moore's Life of Byron, Woolf's Remains. But Aurora Lee is the first woman's Künstlerroman, the story specifically of a woman maker's development and written by a woman. And as such, it will influence generations of poets and writers. Among the many for whom it's immediately formative are George Eliot, Charlotte Mew, the writing duo who make up Michael Field, and Emily Dickinson, who hangs that Rossetti portrait with which we started in her room. But his success isn't limited by gender. Leading male writers, among them Roger Kipling, John Ruskin, Algernon Swinburne, and Oscar Wilde, will celebrate the work for decades. Aurora Lee is a work of fiction whose 9 books map only indirectly onto its author's own life. But it does portray the development of a woman poet. Thus, on her 20th birthday, the poem's protagonist, orphaned Aurora, refuses a marriage which is both loving and advantageous in order to dedicate herself to writing poetry. And just before she does so, she crowns herself with a poet's wreath, saying, "What, therefore, if I crown myself today in sport, not pride, to learn the feel of it?" To learn the feel of it. If she delayed until she or the world felt confident that she deserved poetic laurels, how long would Aurora or Elizabeth wait? In fact, laurel wreaths will crown Barrett Browning's coffin for her civic funeral in Florence. But meanwhile, at 13, in the preface to her printed work, The Battle of Marathon, Elizabeth says, "Happily, it is not now as it was in the days of Pope. Now, even the female may drive her Pegasus through the realms of Parnassus without being saluted with the most equivocal of all appellations, a learned lady, without being celebrated by her friends as a Sappho, or traduced by her enemies as a pedant, without being abused in the review or criticised in society." So that's Elizabeth at 14. Unfortunately, the reception of her work still shows it's not always true. Yet Aurora, or Elizabeth, had her eyes on the prize. Quotes, "She never can be satisfied with the comparative respect, which means the absolute scorn." In other words, what matters to her isn't producing tolerable verse and a kind of ladylike accomplishment, but being a true poet, judged by the highest standards, rather than being judged by the often prejudiced reviewing which she experienced and which she satirizes in Aurora Lee. For example, "Among our female authors, we make room for this fair writer and congratulate the country that produces in these times such women competent to spell." Elizabeth Barrett Browning is not Aurora Lee, but popular and critical reception is a kind of mirror, even a distorting one, as her life story shows us. And her life story obviously is soon to end when this photograph was taken just a month before she died. Literary biography is a kind of mirror too. It's always a Bildungsroman, the adventure story of how the self emerges. And in this sense, the story Elizabeth Barrett Browning tells in Aurora Lee is the one her life story tells too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sampson.
A pleasure.
Thank you. That was remarkable. We learned a lot and we refreshed whatever we forgot about Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So we might owe her resurrection or her renaissance to you right now because of the attention that you've paid to her life. One thing though about the way her life ended, I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, but I'd like to ask you as a biographer, is it true that her laudanum addiction, was it her husband? I don't know if it was Anthony Burgess or someone else who suggested that her husband kind of finished her off in the end. So that would be pretty disappointing if that was true.
Well, Anthony Burgess suggested it.
Okay.
Not that I actually was aware of that when I was writing the book, but a reviewer brought it up. A reviewer kind of though saying nice things about my book, rather missed my point, which was that I don't think he did finish her off, but I think it is possible that he accidentally finished off. It was a kind of unconscious mercy killing aspect too, because whenever she had a really bad attack and was really obviously feverish or had a really bad cough, she would take additional laudanum, and she'd take more morphine than the morphine that she took every day or every evening in order to sleep. And obviously towards the end of her life, she was taking larger and larger quantities, and she was ill, and she did have another chest infection, a very bad one. And, she died in the small hours. So she died in the night, and that, those kind of terrible hours when we are all at our weakest. And, she kind of roused from her sleep, and her husband Robert fed her some chicken soup and tried to warm her, and probably gave her some more morphine at that point too, or she may have asked for it. But and there is something very idealized about his account of her death, which is very she sort of sinks away in his arms, and there is nothing in it which suggests kind of struggling for breath in the ways that we're all thinking about so much in the pandemic, nor indeed of, a high temperature, except that she was sort of virtually hallucinating. She woke from a dream and she said, "Oh, what a beautiful steamer we're on." But that suggests a kind of, not that she was necessarily in delirium, but just that, she was half awake, or she was, she was. It seems to me that, well, it's fairly obvious that we can't know, but it seems to me that I certainly don't think he carried, that he did away with her, because he was grief struck, and he didn't want that ideal life to be over. I think he was emotionally as dependent on her as he had been on his mother. When his mother died, he had a kind of breakdown. And when Elizabeth died, obviously he grieved massively too. And so I think it is more likely that, as, to be honest, happens today in hospitals, not today during the pandemic, but in better times, there is a point at which there is no point in holding back on the morphine, and I think it was like that, really, possibly. And I think that's, is a good thing,
So that's the love story that is very famous.
It is a love story. I think they genuinely were, did make each other very happy. And I think they were genuinely a very loving couple. But I don't think that was the making of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, rather the opposite. I think she was the making of Robert, to be honest. As a person, because she led the move to Italy and that whole kind of life, and his entry into those sort of elevated salons at that level of distinction was on her arm, so to speak. And also, he was, in terms of literary development, he was kind of behind her. He followed the modern, the kind of shift into Victorian poetics that she pioneered. She was pioneering it with Tennyson, and Robert did wonderful things with it, but he didn't do them until after she had done them. So, because he was younger, So,
can I ask something? You said near the beginning that one way you distinguish between the Mary Shelley biography and this biography is between the unconscious making of a writer. I shouldn't say woman writer, I think what we talked about, but obviously, but and this idea that she willed herself from near the beginning of her adolescence to being a writer. Because I've read the book on the Barrett Browning biography. It's a wonderful book, but I wanted to mention to everyone that actually every chapter is titled "How to" or "How not to," and so what it seemed to me was there's an element of mirroring between you and your subject, insofar as there are 9 books, and there's a technique to selfhood. You seem to suggest by the titles of your chapters, just as there's a technique to writing a biography or writing a poem. So I want to ask about that. Is how much do you see yourself reflected or not reflected in your subject, and how did that help or not help writing? I mean, how did that affect the construction of the process?
Thank you so much, Omar. Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for the question too. Yeah, the 9 books comes from there being 9 books in Aurora Lee. So the mirror faces that way for that. But you're right, the how to. I think it's not so much that I see myself in Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It's more that And you're right to say as a woman writer, because I think the problems are intensified even still in the 21st century for women writers. I think the problem of being a writer, which sounds like such a kind of privileged, first world problems thing to be able to say, but the problem of, making a mark on paper, of daring to speak, of kind of authorial voice is which, from moment to moment, most writers struggle with, is much more pronounced still for women writers, because we still don't have so many literary grandmothers, and if we do have them, they tend to have been lost and we have to reclaim them, like Elizabeth. So I think it's paradigmatic. I think a woman writer's life is paradigmatic of a writer's life, and as a writer myself, I'm therefore very interested in writers' lives and women's writers' lives. And Elizabeth I found it very useful thinking about Elizabeth's life, because precisely of the quite slow development, the quite intentional development. And because it does seem to me that as writers, we have two mistresses to deal with. One is the external, one's the internal. The internal is having a gift or a vocation, or what would comprise that gift or vocation, or what are the limits of our gift or vocation, come into a relation with that, the sort of wellspring, even if it's a tiny wellspring. And the other problem, which is around building the fountain for the wellspring to come from. I mean, becoming a writer in those technical ways. And so Elizabeth, because she was such an autodidact, unlike her peers who, of course, had to learn to become writers, and I don't mean it was easy for them, but they had these astonishingly severe but astonishingly strong classical educations. Of course, a classical education is an education in poetics, because all they're doing basically every day from sort of the age of 6 is translating poetry, and great poetry, okay, just from Greek and Latin traditions, but, and I'm simplifying, but nevertheless, that enormous time of apprenticeship and deep relationship with poetic technique, which we forget when we say, oh, well, Keats was writing as a teenager, Shelley was, yeah, but they'd been doing it at such a high level for such a long time. They had done an apprenticeship. So Elizabeth is much more apparent, because she had to find her own way in a much more piecemeal way, rather as we do today, unless we've been lucky enough to have that kind of education. And so it's very visible. And also because she has lots of dead ends or full starts, it's very visible. The process of becoming is extraordinarily visible with her. And again, and possibly also intensified because of all the barriers she had, the disability, the isolation, then the barriers of gender, all those things. And the sheer unexpectedness of it, really, in her family, where no one has to have a profession, and where, although her father obviously had a very good library in which she got to educate herself, because, of course, we also know that, if she had been, for example, my ancestor, my ancestors were sort of, down the mines and in the fields. I mean, there was a huge happenstance, as there always is for all of us, of being born into a location where there is a library of some kind. I mean, we all know that, So, yes, I mean, to be honest, I did see a little bit of myself in Mary Shelley, which sounds enormously arrogant, because obviously she wrote Frankenstein and she was a complete genius. But in terms of recognizing her personality, I felt a real aha about Mary Shelley, the slight nerdishness, that sense she has that other people think she's cold, but she's actually full of feeling, her kind of conscientiousness, her naivety about doing the things that people around her approve of, but it not being approved of in wide society, all those things. There's something very earnest and booky about Mary Shelley that I completely understood.
Right.
But I don't feel that about Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but I don't feel I don't understand her. I just feel I don't have quite that intimacy. It's more like there's someone that I admire and respect and I'm really interested by, and I think is vastly underrated, and I'm astonished by the body of her work. And the more, having read all of it now, instead of the bits, the tranches that I knew before, and I'm astonished that she is overlooked, and I feel very protective and passionate about her, but just at one step back.
Right. Okay. Rhoda, have you got the chat box up?
Yes, I would. Would you like to lead the questions? We have a question by Christine Murray. So you might want to start with that.
Can I ask about Emily Dickinson?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Christian Murray writes, can I ask about Emily Dickinson's tribute to EBB, which is so sad, but also honoring her influence? Dickinson wrote, quote, if you touch her grave, put one hand on the head for me, her unmentioned mourner. So I think she's asked, she wants to know about
Yes, I mean, obviously Emily Dickinson wrote a huge number of poems, so it's not surprising that she wrote a number of poems in tribute to Elizabeth. She did. She called her sort of the silver touchstone, the sense of the silver voice has gone. She was obviously a symbolic touchstone for Emily Dickinson, but of course, it's not like a sort of celebrity culture now. I mean, to state the obvious, she had access to Elizabeth Barrett Browning only through her poetry. So it was the poetry itself, not just the fact that there was a woman writing in Britain, the other side of the Atlantic. It was the poetry itself which spoke to Emily Dickinson. And of course, we find that it's easy for us to be facile now and see that as counterintuitive because their poetics are so different. But they are doing different kinds of important literary work, it seems to me. I mean, Emily Dickinson's work is ahistorical in the sense that it massively stands the test of time. And there is, which you could say on one hand is the only mark of greatness, but I don't think it's quite the only one because there are lots of poetries and other artworks which we can position as very culturally specific, although we still think they're amazing. So, and she has her own very unique, very interior, as it were, apparently interior voice, which is not to say that it's hermetic or whatever. Whereas Elizabeth Barrett Browning is modernizing the poetics of her day. She is really leading the shift from romantic poetry to Victorian poetry, from poetry of ideas and really elevated language, a kind of crystalline poetry, to a kind of more colorful tapestry, narrative, almost conversational voice poetry, which has a very strong ethical drive, really Victorian. So she is, in a sense, much more, well, and in her life too, she's much more participative in the literary currents of her day, and indeed driving them, than Dickinson. And those are both important works. I mean, I think that it's very easy of us all to be heirs who work in at least the European and Anglophone tradition, to be heirs as romantics in slightly forgetting that a poet doesn't emerge in isolation. There's a sense of a kind of romantic idea about certain kinds of poetic authenticity, which I totally believe in. All my emphasis on craft and development doesn't mean I think that that would be anything without what Barrett Browning fills her work with. But I think that as women writers and as contemporary poets, we have a slight tendency, if we're not careful, to forget the importance of culture making, that poetry comes out of a rich humus of reading each other, of reviewing, of editing. Obviously, I'm passionate about that. Translating, I'm obviously passionate about that too. Of dialogue, that every text is in dialogue with every other text, not only in a theoretical way, but actually in a kind of experiential way. And that Elizabeth is doing much more of that work. And some of that work obviously falls away in a sense because, you know, we need her work to speak to the hummus or the tapestry, or whatever you want to call it now, rather than then, as readers who are situated now.
Lucy Harwood, can I read two of her questions, please? Because she's got two of them here. The first one, I think she was asking about the genre of literature, which is similar to the Bildungsroman, but began with a C and a K. I think that's a Künstlerroman, I think she's referring to. But she asks another question, which is, do you think that EBB suffered with internal conflict when she chose to marry Robert Browning? Like you said, her father essentially laid the path for her to become the woman she did.
So it's a really interesting question. Yes, a Künstlerroman is in a sense a subset of a Bildungsroman. I mean, not all Bildungsroman are Künstlerroman, though since they are all told by writers, they have a strong tendency to be also how I became a writer, or how a character became a writer. Even the Sorrows of Young Werther is, which is fictional, is about becoming a poet, so as well as becoming a young man. So I've completely forgotten what the other question was. Sorry.
Do you think that EBB suffered?
Yes. Yes. No, I don't think so. I mean, yes and no. That's to say, she was at first. She was there's a lot of to and fro in her letters, so it takes a year. And at the beginning, there's a lot of explaining her father to Robert, and oh, he does this, but it's because he loves us so much. It's an excess of protectiveness, and then, but there's a shift going on because her father stops being her confidant and Robert becomes her confidant. And so the meaning making starts to be joint with Robert. And Robert models a very different kind of family love, affection, familial affection, where his parents are very unconditional. I mean, they spoil him rotten, to put it another way, and very, very accepting. And so she begins to glimpse that there are other forms of wonderful family love and wonderful love. And you don't have to be, each man kills the thing he loves. You can be supportive and enabling and be supported and be enabled. And so there's a shift. And so I don't think she internalized conflict. I think she worked through it. I think she worked through loving her father, but understanding that she was 40 and she was really successful in the eyes of the world. And yet she still wasn't sort of allowed to go out without permission. And, you know, in a sense, her patience ran out, I think. And it's very interesting that, in a sense, that applied to her siblings too. So her next sister, her patience ran out too. And she gave up and just jolly well got married to her suitor. And they were desperately poor. And then one of the brothers, the same. You know, maybe being on the seat of such a kind of strong, suffocating love as Elizabeth's father gave her, you know, is a burden, and in the end you have to put it down.
Kusai Jrimir asks, if you can describe EBB in one word, what would it be?
Determined.
Right. That's good. Glenda Simino says, brilliant talk. And then she says, could the laudanum addiction itself have been the cause of much of her illness?
Yes, I've thought about that. Thank you. It's a really good question. I've thought about that a lot because, but no, I don't think so. I mean, quite clearly what she had was a terrible cough and she couldn't cope with polluted air. She couldn't cope with cold. And it's sort of not mysterious. I mean, it's mysterious in a sense that, you know, there's a kind of habeas corpus around proper clinical diagnosis that, despite the fact we're all having only Zoom medicine nowadays, but, you know, that you can't, I'm a literary person. I'm not a medic anyway, but even a medic, you know, kind of in a gentleman amateur way, can't retrospectively diagnose, posthumously diagnose, because they can't do a proper clinical examination now of her body, of her, and see what's going on. They can only do things which are reported. And as we know, you can only report what you know. So there isn't yet a concept for an illness. You kind of can't report it. You may not even report the symptoms in ways that we would report them now. So to some extent, Elizabeth's illness has to remain in her own words. But beyond that, in a time without steroid inhalers and without antibiotics, you only need to have asthma or a bronchial tendency to be fighting for your life every time you catch a cold, every winter. It's not mysterious. You know, people had incredibly short lives in those days. And so this kind of, oh, well, was there a psychological, which is, I know not what our questioner is asking, but there is a lot of stuff in the literature about, oh, wasn't there a psychological element to her illness? Well, no. I don't think there was. I think it's quite straightforward. She had lousy health. She writes later on about my horrible vibrating body. I think she was hugely frustrated. And she lived despite the fact, against the grain of this body, which was, you know, poorly in ways which would be managed perfectly well nowadays in the developed world.
G.B. Clarkson, could the laudanum have affected EBB's writing?
Well, this was, I mean, yes, I think it could have. And this was a kind of calumny. And there's a point where during their years in Italy, Elizabeth and Robert became friendly with a couple who were really interested in spiritualism. And the woman, Sophie Exley, started doing a lot of table rapping, started doing a lot of seances. And she was having Elizabeth on, and Elizabeth really wanted to believe because she lived under the shadow of death, you know, it wasn't abstract for her, and because she'd lost her beloved brother. Actually, her two closest in age and closest emotionally brothers had both died, and she and her favorite uncle, who was a kind of godfather, surrogate father almost to her. Lots of people had died. She wanted to believe that life would go on when the body didn't. Again, there's nothing weird about that. Of course she did. And it was a time when mesmerism was almost a science, and when spiritualism was almost a science. And indeed, her own family had been quite interested in Swedenborgism, which is a notion you go on after death. So, and it took her quite a long time. And then she realized that actually these were cons, and she was really upset. But another friend of this woman, then sort of published a calumny saying, oh, well, these airy, dedicated to EBB, a poem, so published basically saying you're a drug addict, saying, oh, these airy fantasies and the elixir that you drink and so on. And Robert had to go and have words with her, because to accuse someone of being in effect, a drug addict in print was then, even more so than now, and particularly a woman, in Victorian society, a terrible thing to do to someone's reputation, and a great way to not only try and take her imagination away from her, but try and take her respectability away from her too. So I don't think it's not like Coleridge, I don't think so. I think it's rather the opposite, actually, that she obviously had enough tolerance. She'd built up enough tolerance against laudanum that she could, be taking it every day and actually be functioning in a energetic, rational way.
Yeah. GB Clarkson, fascinating. Thank you. Glenda Simino, who asked the question, I think, earlier about laudanum might have been the source of one of her illness, just mentions quickly that laudanum does affect the lungs, apparently. I mean,
yes, absolutely. But you have to remember that she's having coughs and so on from very young, and she does have fevers and so on. So I mean, yes, I mean, we can't say no, but I don't think. I think there is that terrible tendency we all have, and that somehow is quite florid around Elizabeth, to blame the victim, to somehow find a way that she is complicit in her illness or her disability, just as somehow she is complicit in some falling short, which I would say is by us as her readers, from her own work, a kind of just an inability to respect her and to actually think, no, maybe it just was the opposite. And the painful truth is that it was incredibly difficult for her, and yet she did push back against her illness. Do you know what I mean? I think it's just really important to hold on to that. I'm just changing
in fact, Christine Murray kind of tallies with that by saying that we can speculate she could control it well because it didn't affect her pregnancy after all. So, I mean, that's kind of tying in with what you were saying, I think.
Yes, exactly. I think she took a maintenance dose. I mean, although you have to remember that she had 4 miscarriages, but then again, she was in her 40s and it's Victorian era, I mean, it's amazing. She had a child at 43, but interestingly, so did her sister who got away, Henrietta, who got away, also had 3 children in her 40s. So, obviously they had kind of good late childbearing genes as well.
I don't think there are at the moment any other comments or questions. I was going to mention one thing I thought, which lovely. I love this bit in the book where you talk about the ghost and the machine and the mind and the body and so on. Obviously she's limited by her embodiment, her illness to a certain extent. That makes her doubly determined. But you mentioned something very interesting at the beginning, is that because of her illness, she was given the opportunity, the freedom to not do the kind of ladylike things that other siblings had to do to become the intellectual she became. So in many ways, it fortuitously, not in any, necessary way, actually helped her in terms of determining her life from the perspective of the present, looking back at her fate, so.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I mean, it was a mixed blessing. I mean, it was a mixture in which there was also, as it were, a blessing. And again, I think that's why people have seized on it as well. She must have done it in order either in a feminist way to resist or in a kind of slightly more manipulative way to get what she needed. I think we're all situated. And I think that, that's one of the ways that she was situated. So you can tell that I'm a Cartesian in that sense, that I do think she was situated inside her body, or, her body was one of the things that was in her life. And I think that it also helps to think about her situatedness in terms of the quite problematic area of slaving money in the family, which also applies to Browning. His grandfather was a slaver, Robert Browning, because I think that it's very easy to look back on these 19th century people and say, oh, well, they had blood on their hands, which they did, and not think about, well, but she also thought that she herself was at risk because she thought that she was of mixed heritage, but also what was she going to do about it? In the sense that if she had walked away from her family and the family money, it would have been literally suicidal, because she would literally be on the street. She would literally have died of starvation. I mean, you know, nobody in the 19th century walked away from their wealth. They might, that doesn't mean it was good that their menfolk or their parents or whatever exploited the world and got it. It doesn't make it good at all. It's an obscenity. But what is your own relationship to that obscenity, and how different, except by degree, is it from all of us in the developed world? You know, when so much of, I don't know, clothes and chips in phones and so on are extracted by enslaved labor in other parts of the world. I mean, you know, we don't have clean hands, and I think Elizabeth didn't have clean hands, but I think she tried to clean them. I think she tried to fight the good fight when she got to adulthood and kind of, as it were, to reason.
Miriam Sete has a question, putting her hand up. So I believe she'll be unmuted. I think, Ruda, will you unmute her? I think, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Professor Sampson, for your very interesting talk. I appreciated your talk very much. And I was literally thrilled by your analysis of the mirror and the female portraits. Obviously it recalled in my mind the most sensational fictionalization of ancestral portraiture. I mean, the picture of Dorian Gray and its spectacular aging and gradual degradation of Dorian's decadent own portrait. But your talk also recalled Middlemarch scene where Dorothea questions the value of pictures amid the degradation of 1820s Rome. So it is there that she's approaching, without knowing it, what John Ruskin, that you mentioned, was to say in 1857 in the Elements of Drawing. So it is I'm quoting, it is the vainest of affectations to try to put beauty into shadows, while all the real things that cast them are left in deformity and pain. Photographs are part of the visual arts. So I wonder whether she shares Ruskin's idea that visual art is, however, unable to represent life.
That's such an interesting question, and thank you. And as Omar will confirm, having read the book, I mean, actually, I continue to explore the idea of portraiture and mirrors and frames. There are framing short 1,000-word essays between each, or thought pieces really, between each chapter, where I try and think about that whole, how Elizabeth is reflected in her work, how we're all reflected in our work, how biography is an incomplete relationship. I mean, it's an asymmetric relationship where the subject who's really the object, doesn't look back at the portraitist of the biographer. I mean, obviously that's different if you work on somebody who's living, but so I'm really interested in all of that. And I think you're right that there is a strain which goes through our Western tradition, which comes from Plato and the cave, doesn't it? That sense of why are we looking at the shadows? Why are we are letting ourselves be look at the shadow play and not realizing that the figures themselves are walking past the mouth of the cave and, you know, in full real color, which I think that each of those stories that you speak to really interestingly illustrates. I'm not sure that that's what Elizabeth thinks about art. I think that she might share with Ruskin the thought. I think she might share with Ruskin the notion that it is not the material world. I think she had quite a strong sense of the restriction of, as it were, an intellectual imagined life versus actually being able to go out into the world of sensuous apprehension, because there's a kind of astonishing joy which infuses her letters when she gets to Italy and is well enough and begins to go outside and can actually see, you know, pick an orange from a tree and eat it, and it's warm and she enjoys her food, and, you know, so kind of suddenly her life goes into full color. So I think she understood the limits of the created as opposed to the given material world. But if you read particularly Casa Greedy Windows, there are long passages about kind of Stendhal syndrome passages, really, about Florence as the city of art, the city of Giotto, the city of Cimbori, and quite a lot of evocation of their paintings, but their paintings as evocations in themselves of kind of soul or spirit or a Christian insight. In other words, there's a kind of sense that the paintings are not descriptions of the material world. They are descriptions or evocations of something beyond that material world, of the spirit inside the person. So it's quite a complex, but you see what I mean? And she also talked about the dead sculpture and the dead tombs of Italy when she's contrasting them with the kind of the Renaissance, the new life of the possibility of, well, Italian Renaissance, of a rebirth of republicanism.
Thank you, Professor. Very interesting. Congratulations.
Thank you. And thank you for your very interesting question, Professor, I suspect.
Christine Murray says writers, oh, sorry. Christine Murray says writers often create the circumstances they require for their craft and inspiration, and hers was a story of survival and transcendence, really.
Survival and transcendence, I agree. I'm not sure we all always get to create the circumstances required. We think we more just do the best we can in what we're given, don't we?
We try.
Yes. You know, you think of, well, I mean, I think of, you know, someone like Irina Ratashinskaya, you know, imprisoned in Siberia, in exile, and memorizing her poems and teaching them to her fellow internees so that they would have a remembered life if not everyone survived. And so, you know, I don't think those were the ideal conditions, but I think that the will to write, the will to make, transcend.
But doesn't that bring up exactly kind of what you've talked about a lot today, which is that limitations are actually the condition of transcendence, and actually a completely open field, you wouldn't really get very far unless you had some sort of limitation against which kind of forces you to transcend, I think.
That's true, Omar, and it's spoken like a poet, because of course that's one of the great claims for poetic form, isn't it? That, you know,
exactly,
the kind of expression of poetic form is what produces freedom. And actually, certainly, I still sort of refer back to my, you know, formations as a violinist, those kind of years of 5 and 6 hours a day of practice, in which through which you learn absolutely that it is technique and discipline that liberates.
Exactly. I mean, I read there's no question. I read something of, you know, Umberto Eco the other day, a few months ago, and he talks about this idea that, you know, when you interpret, there's obviously a complete plurivocality about it, but it's never going to be infinite, because if it was infinite, manyness would fall out of the window. The limit actually gives you the manyness.
Absolutely. Yes. Otherwise, every text would be universal.
And it would be chaos, basically.
Exactly.
Meaningless, yeah. So sorry, Miriam said, it says, let me renew my congratulations on Professor Sampson's brilliant talk.
Thank you very much, Miriam said. They're it's very nice to have such an international set of interlocutors, isn't it?
Yeah, it's,
What
I
a
think it's,
phenomenal session. I mean, thank you so much for being our guest. We are truly honored. This is so much fun. And we also want to tell everyone in the audience that Professor Sampson will be back on the 31st, not discussing Elizabeth Barrett Browning this time, but she will be sharing some of her phenomenal poems with us as well. She'll be reading poems with Professor Ruth Padel and poet Anthony Anaxagoru and Dr. Omar Sabagh and me.
And you, Rula, very importantly.
So this is a session that we are all greatly looking forward to attending. And again, one more time, we want to thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's a huge pleasure, Rula. Thank you very much. And thank you, Omar, too. Thank you so much for inviting me. What a really enjoyable session. Look, I just received today the proofs of the American edition of Elizabeth. So here she is in England, Britain, and here she is in America. I thought I'd share that with you. So it's a celebratory day.
That will be coming out soon in August, right? The American
That's right,
version?
yes.
American, yes.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, everyone, we learned that obviously, apart from Amazon, etc., in Dubai, if you are in Dubai, Virgin and Kuna Kenya shops can source Professor Sampson's biography. So I'm sure most of you will be wanting to read it now. So if you are in Dubai, there are actual physical shops that are sourcing it, as well as, of course, the usual routes through the internet, through Amazon and so on and so forth. I've read the book. It's a wonderful read. Apart from being fascinating, it's a riveting read. I mean, it's a page turner. So it's good fun as well as being good literature. So anyway, thank you, Fiona, for that. That was wonderful. And GB Clarkson says, thank you. So Noura Al-Fahim says, thank you very much. Everyone's thanking. GB Clarkson is absolutely amazing. I look forward even more to reading the book now. Thank you so much. Good.
Well, thank you all. What a joy. What a great thing. And thank you again. And I'm looking forward to all the other sessions in the festival and to reading.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
If anyone, should we mention tomorrow's, or do we not?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, Omar. Yeah.
Tomorrow we have another session at the same time with Peter Salmon. He's going to be talking about Jacques Derrida and his recent biography of Jacques Derrida, published by Verso Books. That'll be fun. I think that it's going to be a really good talk and a really good session. So whoever's here who's available tomorrow as well, please do register, and we'll be here at the same time. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, and everyone have a good night or a good day. All right. Bye-bye.
Good night. God bless everyone.